Richard Burwell, Talking About an Evolution. Talking About an Evolution, Richard Burwell.
Good afternoon, fellow Toastmasters. When I saw and held an iPhone for the first time, I knew I was holding something special. Maybe not fire, the wheel, or the first ape using a stone as a tool. Not that kind of special, but pretty close. I also knew I had to have one. I recently celebrated my 14th service anniversary here at Flow. Reflecting on this milestone got me thinking about my first iPhone. To celebrate getting hired at Fleur, I'd splashed out on one. And don't share this with HR, but I spent most of my new hire orientation playing around with it. Back in those days, iPhones weren't available in Canada, so you had to buy one on the grey market from the US. Then use some fairly suspect software to jailbreak it, remove the carrier lock, and that allowed you to put a regular SIM card in there from Canada. Unless you had a BlackBerry back then, mobile data wasn't really a thing. So most of the functionality only ever really worked on Wi-Fi. And back then, Wi-Fi wasn't so abundant as it is now. So in terms of usefulness, it wasn't all that great initially, but such was the life of an early adopter. But what is an early adopter? There are many ways to approach new ideas, new products, or lifestyles. How you do will tell you a great deal about your personality. Over years of research, Everett M. Rogers, a communication scholar and sociologist, identified some fascinating personality traits that help organize how people will accept an innovation. In his book, Diffusion of Innovations, Rogers describes 5 types of adopter for products and provides insight into each of those types. Based on Rogers' research, the Interaction Design Foundation provides the following definitions. Number 1, innovators. Innovators represent 2.5% of the population. Innovators are the first customers to try a new product. They are by nature risk takers and are excited by the possibilities of new ideas and new ways of doing things. Products tend to be more expensive at their point of release, though some products do defy this trend, and as such, innovators are generally wealthier than other types of adopters. Although in some cases they may adopt products in a very narrow field and devote much of their financial resources to this adoption. Innovators will often have some connection to the scientific discipline in which a new product is generated from, and will tend to socialize with other innovators in their chosen product categories. Innovators are comfortable with the risks that they take. They are aware that some products that they adopt will not deliver the benefits that are promised, or will fail to win massive market appeal. But generally, as I mentioned, innovators are wealthier, so they can afford to take these risks. Next up is the early adopters. Early adopters represent 13.5% of the population. Early adopters are the second phase of product purchases following innovators. These tend to be the most influential people within any market space, and they will often have a degree of thought leadership for their potential adopters. They may be very active in social media and often create reviews and other materials around new products that they strongly like or dislike. Early adopters will have a reasonably high social status, which in turn enables thought leadership, reasonable access to finances, high levels of education, and a reasonable approach to risk. However, they do not take as many risks as innovators and tend to take more reasoned decisions as to whether to become involved in a particular product. They will try to obtain more information than an innovator in this decision-making process. Next up, we have the early majority, 34% of the population. As a product begins to have mass market appeal, the next class of adopter to arrive is the early majority. This class of adopter is reasonably risk-averse and wants to be sure that their often more limited resources are spent wisely on products. They are, however, generally people with better than average social status, and while not thought leaders in their own right, they will often be in contact with thought leaders and use the opinions of these thought leaders when making their adoption decisions. The late majority represents the next 34% of the population. The late majority is rather more skeptical about product adoption than the first 3 classes of adopters. They tend to put their resources towards tried and tested solutions only, and are risk averse. As you might expect, in general terms, this category of adopter has less money, lower social status, and less interaction with thought leaders and innovators than the groups of adopters that came before. The late majority rarely offer any form of thought leadership in a field. Lastly, we have the laggards. Laggards representing the remaining 16% of the population. Laggards are the last to arrive at the adoption party, and their arrival is typically a sign that a product is entering decline. Laggards value traditional methods of doing things and are highly averse to change and risk. Typically, laggards will have low socioeconomic status and rarely seek opinions outside of their own limited social set. However, it is worth noting that in many cases, laggards are older people who are less familiar with technology than younger generations, and in these cases, they may still have a mid-level of socioeconomic status. It is important to remember that, as with any generalization, not all members of a class of adopter will conform to the general patterns of that class. There will be high-income, well-educated, risk-taking laggards, as well as low-income, poorly educated, non-thought leader early adopters. There are also plenty of older people familiar with technology. At the time when I started writing this piece, I thought myself an early adopter, and the more observant of you will have heard me describe myself as such. But having absorbed Roger's descriptions and insights, I've started to question whether that was true. Maybe I was actually in the early majority, or maybe, as Rogers observes, as I get older, my place on the product lifecycle adoption curve is changing. How about you? Are you an innovator, a laggard, or more likely somewhere in between? All these different modes of adoption reflect on your personal choices. What's in your pocket? How long have you had it? Do you change products like you change your mind? However you approach it, your style is uniquely you, and that's just how it should be.